We're going to be taken on a magical journey through the sights and sounds that make up the 80s. This is Beverly Magazine, with this week's special guest, Mr. Casey Kasem. And now, the host of Beverly Magazine, Mr. Brett Berry. Hello again and welcome to Beverly Magazine. Today we have with us one of the most listened to radio and television announcers in the world today, Mr. Casey Kasem. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brett.
First of all, I'd like to ask you, in your business, has it ever bothered you that people know you for what you sound like and people don't usually see you? Mm-hmm. Has that ever bothered you at all?
No, because in just about every city that I've worked, I've had a television show, and you sort of get used to people recognizing you, and you get that part of your ego satisfied earlier in the career. 15 years ago, I did a show in Hollywood called Shebang that was produced by Dick Clark and Golden West Broadcasters. Mm. So we were on for 650 shows, an hour show, and so you sort of enjoy the anonymity after a show goes off the air, and then people don't recognize you on the street or in restaurants. But more recently, because of the new show being on all over the country, the TV show America's Top 10,
America's Top 10, yeah.
Once again, people, you know, will introduce themselves and will recognize me.
But a lot of people have told me, and I personally feel the same way, that when I've seen your show, your voice is very different from what you look like in person. I mean, you know, the association is completely different, you know?
Well, that's true. I think most radio people, or most people, don't sound like their voices. Yeah. A lot of radio broadcasters who were active in dramatic TV radio shows many, many years ago. Some of the leading men didn't look like leading men the way we've
perceived them today.
Seen them and on the screen. So a lot of them are 5'5", 5'6", you know, and they're playing men with huge voices who are supposed to be Lone Ranger types. So
you don't have to be a big guy to sound big, right?
Well, you don't even have to have a big voice to sound big. It's all attitude.
So a lot of
some of the squeakiest voices in broadcasting. Look at Marlon Brando.
That's right. Marlon
Brando's voice is very thin.
Uh-huh.
If Marlon Brando had to play the character on radio that he's played in motion pictures, his attitude would have to be very strong,
mm-hmm.
and his interpretation would have to be very good in order to create that character that he does on the screen with his face.
Where was it that you first created your style? Where did your style first begin to mold? Was it in Detroit?
Well, I was very lucky. When I was in high school, we had a very active radio club, and that was back in the late 40s. And we did dramatic shows. I did sports announcing. I created a sports show. A friend of mine and I decided that the PA system needed a sports show 3 days a week. So we went to all the sports events and we wrote sports news. And that's where I really started doing it on a weekly basis while I was in high school. And at the same time in high school, we did a lot of dramatic shows, the classic things, the Edgar Allan Poe stuff and things like that.
That makes you more well-rounded, doesn't it?
Well, what it did is it teaches you to work with a microphone, just the way you are learning to work with that camera. Mm-hmm. And anyone who has to work with the tools that he's given has to use them on a daily basis and in every way you can. And then eventually what happens is that's when the style starts taking place. That's when you recognize which side of the face you look best.
When did you recognize that you were a talent, per se?
I think when I was this big. I think the first time I ever did anything in grade school, when I was asked to do any kind of acting or performing, I was always willing to get up on stage and do it, and gamble, and lose, and fail.
And win, sometimes.
Well, right. If you win 5 out of 10 times, you're batting 500.
That's right.
But the 5 times that you lose can be quite humiliating.
But you learn from them.
That's right.
That's the whole point of it. Is your real name Casey, or is that a show name, Casey Kasem? You know?
Yeah. Casey came from playing baseball and from my last name, Kasem. And people used to call me Case. And then when I became a sports announcer, I figured Kamel, which is my given name, it doesn't sound like a sports announcer's name.
No.
So I said, I'll call myself Casey Kasem. Kamel Casey Kasem. So I'll have a nickname of that sounds more athletic.
And it also sounds more show business type name.
Yeah, and with an ethnic name like Kamel, which I was named after Kemal Ataturk, who was the ruler of Turkey back at the beginning of the century. And my father was Lebanese, had read about him and had respected him. He was a man who had revolutionized the Turkish language. Overnight had people reading and writing a different form of language. And so he did something miraculously in one generation, and my dad had a lot of respect for him.
Do you find that people like to listen to your shows because of your voice? What do you think that you have that other announcers don't have?
Well, that'd be a question I think you should ask somebody else. What do you think?
I think that your voice sounds very, it sounds very powerful. It has a lot of dynamic tones to it. It makes you want to listen, you know. A lot of people just, you know, turn you off. You don't even want to listen to them. But you have that certain something that makes you want to listen and you want more. And it just catches on, you know. Right. I think that's the way a lot of people might feel. Do you think that's part of it?
I think it's what I say that's more important. And, of course, the way I say it is important, too. I'm a pretty good storyteller. And in order to tell stories, you have to be just an old-fashioned storyteller. And you have to use the tricks that people use. You have to start off your stories with once upon a time. But very often you don't lead off the first sentence in a story about Smokey Robinson with once upon a time, so you do it with voice inflection. You do it with a once upon a time attitude without saying the word. For instance, I'm going to tell you a story about a guy whose first 100 songs were rejected by Berry Gordy, president of Motown Records. But his 101st became the first top 10 record that Motown ever had. And so it's the attitude, and you're right, it's the dynamics that you use in your voice so that it doesn't sound flat. But it's merely allowing yourself to put your entire body into what it is you're doing and to totally concentrate on what it is that you're trying to say.
Are you very good at, like, cold readings, or do you need to read things over to try?
Very good at cold readings.
Are you really?
And that because I started out as a radio actor on the Lone Ranger show and Sergeant Preston of the Yukon back in Detroit. They originated there. And as a radio actor, in high school, a lot of the things that I did were cold readings. And radio actors at that time had to be very, very fast at grasping a character and getting to the heart of the thing, because there was no time to rehearse. It's not like going into the theater where you have time to develop your character, so you have to grab almost a superficial character. And then you have to work a lot of technique and a little bit of magic to make it sound like that person and create in the mind of the person who's listening to you on the radio what it is you have to create.
Well, every Sunday at 9 o'clock, you have American Top 40. It goes out on, I think, the local radio station, KISS FM.
Right.
And in that show, you come off like very astute, very, you know...
Serious.
Serious, yeah.
Right.
Do you find that people that listen to that show, you know, listen to that show because of your voice?
Not the voice. I think that what we do on American Top 40 is, first of all, we play the 40 biggest records in the country.
And there are a lot of stations that do that.
That do it. I believe that what we do and what we try to do is to create, in the 4 hours, drama. In at least 3 times an hour, there is a tease and a payoff. And therein lies the drama. Now, if you're driving across town in a car and you've only got 10 minutes, if the drama lasts for 4 hours, well, you don't have time to take it all in. However, if in a 15-minute time span, you can hear 4 hit records and a story and information about those hit records, then you've heard an entire program.
That's right. That's what's always interesting about the show. You say, well, next coming up, we're going to tell you a little about Smokey Robinson or whatever. And you have to keep listening. You know, your curiosity is just held there for a little while.
Part of the secret of that is to make sure that you don't exploit someone, and that people who are listening will feel comfortable that you're not going to say something that will offend them, will offend their ethnic group, will offend their favorite stars, their kind of music. So the show has a positive aspect that I'm very proud of.
It is.
And we're very careful that what we say has credibility. And what we say, we try to say poetically, in the least number of words. And so, and also not to give too much icing on the cake, because then what happens is it becomes a documentary and not a disc jockey show. So American Top 40 is first a 4-hour disc jockey show that plays the biggest hits in the country, counted down. Secondly, it's an information show. And the information has to be entertaining or it's not worth doing. So because there are so many trivia buffs in America today, and because people like dealing with numbers in America and always have, and top 10 or number one,
they always will.
Then I think the show will always have a place in radio.
How did you get involved in American Top 40? Was it a couple years ago?
No, when I was a kid and thought I wanted to be a baseball player and a professional baseball player, I used to work for a little grocery store about as big as this stage, Mr. Stalinsky's grocery store. And I used to go in there after playing baseball and work a few hours at night and make a few dollars and help out the family. And I remember listening to the radio one day and saying, you know, if I wanted to be a disc jockey, I'll bet you I could be a good disc jockey. But I don't want to be just a disc jockey. I would like to be heard by everybody in the world. And then I remember hearing a guy who counted down the top 10 in Canada, whose name was Eddie Chase, and he worked at CKLW. And every week he would count down the top 10 nationally in the United States on this Canadian station. And I said, now, that's what I'd want to do, because I know nothing about music, yet when a song gets as high as the top 10, because through osmosis, I can almost be familiar with the song or the lyric or the tune. So I said, now I would think that would appeal to more people than just playing new records. So that was always in the back of my head. If I'm going to be a disc jockey, then shoot for the top and try to become a disc jockey who is known around the world.
By the way you say that, it makes you think that anyone who wants to do something enough can do it, because you wanted to be a baseball player, and I'll bet you would have been a good one.
Well, I think up to a point. I think anyone who wants to do something can do it, and I probably would have ended up playing in the minor leagues and become a manager and eventually probably go on into sports announcing or something like that. I think you're right. But I think that you also have to be smart enough to recognize that if you're giving too much effort to one thing and you're not seeing any results, and I mean results by merely somebody slapping you on the back and saying, boy, that was a pretty good reading you did the other day in class, or gee, I really liked what you did this and that. If you don't get some feedback, then maybe you're in the wrong business. You have to be able to evaluate where you are. And if you're not somewhere in the top 10 in what you're doing with your contemporaries and your colleagues, then maybe you better find another outlet for your energy.
Well, what if the feedback that you get is not good feedback? What if it's negative feedback, but it's still feedback? Let's say you get good feedback and bad feedback.
Well, there's an inner sense of direction, a Muhammad Ali kind of direction that people who are in show business have. And what it is it's almost a blindness. Remember, when I go back and listen to myself as a disc jockey in Detroit, if I played it for you and you evaluated it, you would have said, you should never have been a disc jockey. You should never have been in broadcasting. You're really bad. And I was bad.
But I guess you knew your own potential.
I knew that because ever since I was that high, whenever I got on stage, somebody liked something that I did. And I thought I was always as good as the people I worked with, but I went a step further. When I was a kid listening to the radio and listening to young people with young voices doing dramatic radio shows, I always knew I was as good as they were. I just knew it. And I knew if I had the opportunity, I could perform. And even as early as in intermediate school, I remember they had a school-wide audition to stand in front of a microphone with copy and read 3 pieces of copy and create 3 characters, and the winners, boy and girl, would go on to work at the educational radio station and do dramatic radio. Well, I won that in about the 8th grade. So that also gave me confidence and I guess success breeds success. The more success you have, the more you want.
What got you started in radio and television, though? What was your first break?
Well, in high school in radio, and then when I left high school, I went to college and I got the starring role in their big show at Wayne State University called Scoop Lion Cub Reporter that was broadcast on a local 50,000-watt station, WJR.
Oh, yeah.
And then I was working on Saturday morning for a show called Quiz Down that was put on by the ABC station, radio station in Detroit. A bunch of kids got together, and they're a quiz master, and they had a guest star every week that would come and ask certain questions. And I was the usher, and I made $4.75 every Saturday morning as the usher. And the engineer for that particular broadcast and I used to listen to a radio that they gave away to the winning school. And it was Saturday morning at 10 o'clock, and we used to tune in my radio show of Scoop Ryan Cub Reporter on that 50,000-watt station. And he listened, he says, you know, you're really good as a young voice. He says, you're very animated, and he says, you interpret beautifully. He says, how long have you been doing it? I said, I just started college, I just started doing it. He says, you know, I work on the Lone Ranger show, and they're looking for a new Lone Ranger's nephew, Dan Reed. You ought to read for it. Well, make a long story short, I read for it. Dan didn't leave, but I started doing character roles, and that was my first professional work.
And right now you're doing cartoon characters?
And I do cartoon characters very much like the old days of radio acting. Do Robin on Super Friends.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And do Shaggy on Scooby-Doo.
Oh, yeah.
We've been on for about 11 years with that now.
Oh, yeah.
And on Mark on Battle of the Planets. I've done about 2,000 cartoon shows.
Are most radio and television announcers as successful as you are? I mean, is it easy to become successful? It seems like a very competitive business.
It is, but I think that, to answer your question honestly, probably not. And the reason being is there are different areas of broadcasting that I'm in. As a cartoon person, I could make a living at it. As a disc jockey, could make a living at it. As just a commercial announcer doing commercials, could make a living at it. What else is there? I do some acting too, theatrical act. But because of the different, and also I also do promos for NBC.
Yeah, right.
That are on every night in prime time, probably 15 or 20 times a night. So there are different areas that I've been successful at. Most announcers are successful as disc jockeys, or successful as disc jockeys and voiceover people doing a few commercials. There are a handful of people who do very, very well on either coast doing commercials.
But
voice work in commercials.
Your advantage is that you kind of dip your hand in a little bit of everything, and people know your voice in a lot of different areas. I bet that gets you a lot of work.
The thing that gets you the work the most is the audition, and if it's good. And because people want to discover new people in the advertising business, producers, directors, agency people, they're always willing to listen. And as long as I can audition, then I've got an iron in the fire. And that's why, no matter how successful I may become, I always want to audition for anybody who wants to listen. Because when you stop auditioning, it doesn't take long before they say,
downhill,
whatever happened to, you know.
Yeah, but does it seem like most people will watch your show and they'll say to themselves, well, you know, I've seen Casey Kasem, and do people say that, you know, you're going downhill sometimes? What do you feel when people say that?
I've never had anybody say I'm going downhill.
Because you keep your hand in everything.
Well, I don't know. There's the old story that the evolution of a person's career in show business is, who's Casey Kasem? Get me Casey Kasem. Get me someone like a Casey Kasem. And then the next step is, whatever happened to Casey Kasem? So you have that evolutionary period, but you have to remember that show business is 2 words. And what a lot of people fail to do is to cover their bases in our business. Actors do this, and people in my work, in voice work, do the same thing, and that is they start taking their talent and their success for granted. And as a result, they say, well, what do I have to audition for? They know what I sound like. If they really want me, let them call up my agent and they can get me.
That's
Can't
what I was
do
just
that.
thinking.
Can never do that.
So you still audition?
For instance, yesterday I did 3 auditions for 3 different products. And I'm sure all 3 agencies I've worked for before know what I sound like. But not really. See, when you have a dozen people in town who are equally as good, what's going to help the man make the decision? The only thing that's going to help the man make the decision is if he can hear everybody. And then after he hears, and well, there's a whole philosophy behind auditioning that I have that we won't get into.
But usually, don't they have something in mind? They say, well, you know, we're going to audition Casey Kasem, but I really think he's got what we want. He's got the sound, you know? Isn't that something that happens sometimes?
What they'll usually do is they may even say, get me somebody who sounds like a Casey Kasem. That happens a lot. Yeah. But I've gone to auditions where they'll say, look, what they're really looking for, but he's not available because he already has an airline, someone who sounds like Barry Sullivan or Roger Davis, or and so what you do is you try to give that attitude, and so you're not one-dimensional. And so I've been very fortunate in being able to adapt somebody's style without sounding like them. There's certain people who have distinctive qualities in their voices and attitudes.
That's right.
That if you can zero in on them, and one of the things that I think I did is I became a student of voice work. For instance, I know who the voices are that are working. And if I hear somebody new, I want to find out who he is. If he's doing something that's interesting and has a quality. There's a fellow in New York who's excellent. You hear every night no less than 10 times. He does American Express. He's on everything. His name is Peter, I can't think of his last name.
He's got to be good, though, if you hear him all the time, right?
You know, Peter Thomas. Peter Thomas has a way of speaking that sounds corporate, but friendly. It sounds like he has a tie and a suit on.
Yeah.
It sounds like he's got a wonderful face, and you just believe everything he says. But he always has a suit on. Now, I don't always have a suit on when you hear me. There are times that I'm more relaxed in the commercials that I do. But he has a certain corporate sound that allows you to accept that corporate image, which a lot of people turn off to. You know
well, if it's subtle enough, it's got to be corporate, but so the average person listening will say, well, I can relate to that to a certain extent, right?
And he has that quality, and he's probably the busiest guy in New York. But I had mentioned his name as early as 4 years ago in this town, and nobody knew who he was. I'll mention somebody else that you won't know who is, and your audience won't know.
This is someone that's going to be coming up.
Somebody who has already been there, somebody who taught us all how to do it.
Yeah.
And his name is Mason Adams. You know who he is?
Sounds familiar.
Okay, you see him if you've ever watched the Ed Asner show.
Oh, of course, I know him. I know him.
You know who I'm talking about. He's the editor.
Yeah,
right?
The older gentleman.
Right, and he talks like this.
Yeah,
right?
Right.
And he does Smucker's Jam, and once he think he did Bank of America.
Right.
And that's just the way he talks. And he's got a range like this. Well, he's probably the granddaddy of all the announcers. And the reason I say that is because he was one of the first people to do commercials in a more relaxed style and without sounding like the big voice announcer, where everything had to be articulated. He threw away syllables. He didn't cross T's.
Yeah.
He eliminated periods. And so he, as early as way back there in the early 50s and late 40s, and he was also Pepper Young on a show that was a big radio show for 25 years. So he also was a student of voice, and so I knew what he could do. As a matter of fact, when I was in 1949, I used to impersonate him.
Really?
In high school.
Yeah.
And there are some other people whose names I could mention that you wouldn't know that I impersonated as well. So if you're in a business, it's important you know who your competition is and to be familiar what it is that they do best. And it surprises me sometimes when people say, I want to get into voice work. I say, and I'll mention a few names. Do you know who these people are?
No.
They said, no. I said, well, you have to know who they are to know what it is you're competing against, and then try to find out who you sound like and hear some of the things he does, and then tape them off the air and then try to see if you can match it.
But to become successful, it seems like sometimes it's better to be a little bit gutsy. Maybe it's better not to sound like so-and-so. Maybe I can create something a little new.
I think you're right.
Isn't that what you have to do sometimes?
I think you're right. I think it's like, I think you need a combination. I think what you have to do is you have to have a door opener. A lot of people are their own worst enemies when it comes to opening doors. They're iconoclastic. They want to change the way things are. Well, that's fine, and I buy that. But if they could just temper that a little bit. See, I've done all that too. I've been fired for insubordination at a station in Buffalo for telling them how to operate their radio station. I lasted 90 days, and they fired me. We went to arbitration, and they wrote a book that thick on how bad an employee I was.
Oh, okay.
You see, a little bit later on, when somebody said to me, don't do a comedy show anymore, Casey. I said, but wait a minute. This was in San Francisco. I said, I'm the #1 disc jockey. I beat baseball and everything.
Yeah.
I said, we're not going to do it. I might go on the air and do something else.
Why would you do that?
Well,
Jealousy?
the man didn't know. The general manager just didn't want comedy on his radio station anymore.
Oh.
So I said, what'll I do? And that's when I found my career in a trash bin. That's when I walked into the door that night and jammed in the door of the studio was a big trash bin. You probably have them around here for throwing out old news copy.
Right.
And right on top of it was the who's who of 1962. And so that night I went in there, and that's when I started doing the teaser bio format like American Top 40.
It sounds like your bases really weren't covered at that time in your life, huh? Were they?
Well, I think that that God was sort of looking over my shoulder and was my partner. And it helps also to, for me, it's always been the closer that I am with God and my communication, the easier I find opening doors can be. And I think once you open the door, then you have an opportunity to get in there and function with those new tools and with those new people and absorb what it is that you have to learn so that you can polish what it is you've got going for you.
How do you, what keeps you going though? What keeps you persisting, even though, let's say your colleagues may say, well, you know, I don't think he's that great?
I've never had that happen.
But yeah.
See, I've always, since I can remember, been encouraged to do what it was that I did.
Your parents also?
My parents just never interfered. My father wanted to be a lawyer, but they always felt that I had a feeling for the direction that I was taking, and I worked very hard at everything I did. And everything I did, if I worked in Mr. Stilinski's grocery store, was to do it better than anybody else.
Be the best at whatever you do.
To try to be the best at whatever I did. And if I really weren't good at it, if I weren't adequate, I couldn't play basketball. When the coach said, I don't think you're going to make it, I was smart enough to say, right, let's leave that for the tall guys.
So now, so it's something that, you know, it's an inner thought that you say, you know what you're good at, you know what you're not good at.
Set the goals high. See, if you're an actor, set the goal, make an Academy Award, an Oscar. If you're a disc jockey, make it to be heard by more people than anybody else has ever been heard by, and so on.
Just keep going, no matter what you've done. Just keep going, persisting, and keep the high goals there, right?
Right, and somewhere along the way, make sure that you get enough education so that once you get that success, you know what to do with it.
What's your saying? Look up to the sky.
Keep your feet in the ground and keep reaching for the stars.
That's the way everyone should think, right?
Right.
Thank you very much for coming on the
Brett.
show, Casey. It's great to have you, and I'll be seeing you again. My name is Brett Berry. Thanks for joining us.